Hey everybody, Charles from GMAT Ninja here. Today we're going to talk about how to tackle the very hardest reading comprehension passages on the GMAT and executive assessment. So who's this video for? Let's say that you've mastered the basics of reading comprehension and you have a good repeatable process. So when you watch our other reading comprehension videos, you go, yeah, I'm basically drawing the same conclusions from each paragraph that the guys in the videos are doing if you watch Harry or Alex or my videos. And you might be saying, well, I'm doing pretty well, scoring in the high 30s or low 40s on GMAT verbal, maybe missing a couple of questions on a verbal section, or maybe on the EA, you're scoring in the low teens on verbal, again, missing one or two questions. And you might say, I'm doing really well, but I'm not quite where I want to be. I want elite. I want to score in the mid 700s on the GMAT, or I want to score above a 160 on the EA. This video is for you. And look, if you're just looking for a little bit of extra practice, want to do a few more passages with us, that's fantastic too. My friendly warning is I'm going to give you really tough passages here today. I'm going to try to make your eyes bleed. So if you're kind of scoring around the average, so let's say a 10 on the executive assessment verbal or a 30 on the GMAT verbal, you might struggle with these. That's okay. The practice might still be good for you. But just a friendly warning, we're assuming that your process is already pretty darn good. You're doing fairly well on the GMAT or the EA reading comprehension, and we're going to really challenge you with the hardest stuff here today. All right, organization of the video, I'm going to give you a few general tips and wisecracks about how to improve if you're going for a super elite score on reading comprehension, and then we're going to launch right into the toughest passages that I can find. I think they're rough, to be honest. First couple times I saw them, I struggled. I've seen my students get wrecked by them over and over. Should be fun. All right, so let's say that you're going for that super elite reading comprehension performance, GMAT or executive assessment. What do you need to do to get there? So I need your process to be flawless. So the same process we model in all of our videos. I'm not going to rehash it here. I'm going to assume that you already know basically what you're doing. You're gunning for the big picture. You're stopping the very paragraph. You're digesting that big picture, the purpose in a really useful way. So I'm going to assume that you already have that in hand. Here's the one part that I think I want you to really keep in mind as you get to the toughest passages. Don't obsess. I know we say that in a lot of our videos, but as you get to the harder and harder and harder passages, it gets really, really tempting to say, I'm going to squeeze this thing. I'm going to read it and read it and read it until I understand every single word. Don't do that. That's never a great idea. Read the paragraph enough that you understand why the author's written it, how it connects to the other paragraphs, and move on. If a couple sentences get really hairy, don't read them over and over and over. Maybe you can get away without them. Maybe you can get away with a halfway understanding of them. Don't obsess. Don't do anything differently just because the passage is hard for you. It should be the same repeatable process every single time, no matter what. Hard, easy, short, long, science, some other topic, doesn't matter. Tip number 2. As you get to these really, really hard questions, these hard passages, I want you to embrace the struggle. A lot of the battle is you're trying to go from, let's say, something like 80th or 90th percentile in reading comprehension into the 95th, 99th percentile. A lot of it's psychological. So your skills are already pretty darn good. If you're scoring a 40 on GMAT verbal, you've got really good skills. You're probably a really good reader. Now, as you try to push into the upper echelons of the score scale, it's going to hurt. And you need to embrace that feeling of, hey, I'm getting my head pounded here. And the question is, can you fight through that, still get enough out of the passage that you can answer the questions correctly? And it is very, very common that you're going to see passages. There's chunks of it as you get to the higher levels where you're really going to struggle. That's okay. Embrace it. See what you can squeeze out of it anyway. Quick story. One of my all-time favorite former students, have an article about her on our website at gmatninja.com. I call her Ms. HP because she's a big fan of Chinese hot pot of all things. So she did 4,000 LSAT practice questions for reading comprehension and critical reasoning. I'm going to repeat that: 4,000 critical reasoning and reading comp questions. She was so devoted to this and so maniacal with her work ethic. She actually hid them from me when I was tutoring her because I told her to take it easy a little bit because she was doing a little too much, not getting enough sleep. She proved me wrong, and she worked like crazy. And after she took the test, she was passing her books along to me to pass on another student. And we started leafing through the books and counted and realized that she'd done more than 4,000 questions. Now, my argument here isn't that you should do that. That's a lie. You probably don't need it. Here's what I would say. Ms. HP really embraced the pain, really embraced the struggle, really embraced the challenge of getting better at this. She became a better reader, became better at fighting her way through. At some point, I'm convinced the diminishing returns set in terms of her actual skills. Maybe 1,000 questions was enough for her, but she was convinced that doing more would help her. Her psychology was pitch perfect by the time she got to the test. She felt like she could conquer anything. She'd battled through so many hard passages. She just got great at getting pounded in the head by hard passages. And by the time she got to that test, she was so confident from all the practice she had done and all the struggles she'd embraced that she performed wonderfully. Got a 750, went to Harvard, married a classmate, good Midwestern boy. They have 2 beautiful children. Life is great. Again, I'm not telling you to do 4,000 questions, but I think she's a wonderful illustration of, yeah, embrace that pain, embrace that struggle. Smaller quantities are fine. And a lot of it really is psychological and just getting used to that feeling. Because no matter how good you are, you probably will run into stuff on the test where you're struggling with a sentence or struggling with a paragraph or struggling with a whole passage. And that's okay. Can you fight through it, apply good process, and get what you can out of it? All right. Tip number 3, optimize your focus and performance. I'm not going to say a ton about this in this video, but as you start to fight for every last little inch toward the top of that verbal score scale, sometimes it's a question of you're just a little bit better rested, a little bit better able to focus. So that's part of why here at GMAT Ninja, we have a whole bunch of content. We have a whole bunch of experts on our team. We have a personal trainer with a psychology degree who helps people design exercise for mental performance and mental stamina. We have a mindfulness coach, and there's all sorts of peer-reviewed studies that show that training in mindfulness can improve your focus on standardized tests, can improve your results. We have a performance coach who focuses on test anxiety. We send people to a nutritionist who's pretty brilliant and can help you design your diet so that you can focus better, have better stamina. We have a sleep coach as well. I'm not saying you need to pay a whole bunch of money for an expert. I just want you to be really conscious. Is there something you can do leading up to your test day where you're taking better care of your body, sleeping better, eating better, exercising a little bit more, or exercising a little bit smarter, meditating a little bit more so that you can focus better on test day as you fight for those high scores? That extra little bit of performance can really, really help you. Give it some thought, pay attention to how you're doing, and see if there's something you do to optimize your performance through better sleep, better nutrition, better care for your body, better mental skills, maybe reducing your anxiety. All right. Number 4, kind of related. I want you to demand consistent data from your practice. So you might know by now here at GMAT Ninja, we're huge fans of the LSAT as practice for GMAT critical reasoning and reading comprehension. Actually, the 2 passages I'm going to go through today, they're both LSAT passages, really tough ones. For the most part, critical reasoning and reading comp, LSAT is very similar to the GMAT, maybe a little bit tougher. And the thing I love the most, every section on the LSAT is roughly the same difficulty and length as every other section. So you can take a whole bunch of critical reasoning and reading comp sections from the LSAT, compare your performance over time. And what we're looking for is consistency. All of your time should be in an error little range. All of your error counts should be in an error little range. If you're not seeing that, you're seeing variability from day to day, that's a sign that your approach, your psychology, maybe your energy levels or your focus aren't consistent from day to day. And you really need to look hard at yourself and go, what can I do to smooth this out a little bit? And it could be anything. Again, could be something physical, could be something psychological, could be that your process isn't quite as streamlined as it needs to be. So pay really close attention to that data. You want those super elite scores. All of your sections should look roughly the same in terms of accuracy and in terms of your time. Last thing, reading skills. Nobody likes to hear this, but sometimes what it takes to get those super high verbal scores on the GMAT and EA, sometimes you just need to be a really great, really precise reader. Be honest with yourself. If you're not a super precise reader, maybe there's a ceiling. Maybe the remedy for that is just to do a whole lot of reading and become better slowly over time. Now, I might make the argument that Ms. HP here, how did she get better? Well, maybe in doing 4,000 questions, she became a better reader. I just want you to be aware that that's a slow process. And if that's what you need to score at the highest levels and it's worth it to you, maybe that is a longer journey of 6 months or more of just getting better at reading really hard stuff in English. So be honest with yourself if that's part of the picture. All right, with that, here come 2 of my favorite passages. Not favorites as in I enjoy them, because to be honest with you, I really don't. But 2 of my favorites in the sense that I've seen students just get wrecked by them. So if you're going for that elite score, stick with us and try to fight through these passages with us. All right, go ahead and take a moment on that first paragraph. All right, if you need more time, feel free to hit the pause button as always. Okay, part of why I picked on this particular passage, one of many reasons. The biggest one is that when I look at the stats on how people do on this passage, you guys get absolutely clobbered on it. And I've seen my students suffer on it. It's not necessarily the most dense language, but the questions end up being really, really tough. When I look at this first paragraph, though, the feature of it that I think makes it difficult is it's really not obvious where the author's trying to take us. A lot of reading comp passages on the GMAT and EA, or the LSAT for that matter, kind of introduce something in the beginning and say, hey, here's a controversy in a field that we're trying to adjudicate, or you see the author's point of view right away. Here, it's really tough to find it. But again, good process here. I want you to really fight for purpose. Why do we think the author wrote this? Do we see any points of view being presented? Not a ton here, but I think there's a couple subtle bits that I want to make sure catch your eye. So first, in that first sentence, I think it's interesting that the author says that the painters, so these pre-World War I painters, they developed works of art that some have described as prophetic. Author's not saying that the author, him or herself, thinks they're prophetic, but says some other people over there, I guess, described as prophetic. Interesting. So a little bit of an indication that we're describing somebody else's point of view. Interesting. Put a pin in that for a second. Later on in the paragraph, you kind of get this wisecrack that the artistic styles they brought into being varied widely, but all the styles had in common a very important break with traditions. Okay, so we're starting to see just the faint outlines of an opinion here by the author. So we've got these pre-World War I painters. And what do we know about them? Well, we know that they developed works that some describe as prophetic. We'll say some call prophetic. We know the styles varied widely. These new styles that they brought into being. And now I've got this bit at the end. Important break with traditions. With these representational traditions of representational art that stretch back to the Renaissance. And I'll just say from tradition right there. Okay, do I feel like I'm really clear about the author's purpose? No. Do I feel like I'm really clear about the author's point of view? Nope. But again, your job here is to fight for it. Make sure you can kind of look at this paragraph and go, okay, do I see anything here that indicates where the author is trying to take us? I guess so. So these World War I painters, some people call them prophetic. This author seems to be saying, yeah, there's all kinds of different styles that these pre-World War I painters brought into being. But what they had in common was this important break from tradition. Seems like there's some skepticism of the idea that they're prophetic and that they predict some sort of anticipated future that would be different, but they do have a very important break from tradition. All right, it's about the best we can do. Like I said, pretty tough paragraph as far as trying to get anything meaty from it. Let's see what the next paragraph brings. As always, hit the pause button if you need more time. All right. So as always here, the better of a job we do on that first paragraph, again, without obsessing, but if we can make some sense of where the author's trying to take us in the first paragraph, couldn't make a ton of sense. We got a little bit there. It's going to help us make sense of that second one in the subsequent paragraphs. What's going on here? So you've kind of got this phrase right at the beginning. So fundamental is this break with tradition that it's not surprising to discover that these artists, just some examples, are credited with having anticipated political and social disruptions and upheavals of the modern world. So it's an important break from tradition. So the author calls this so fundamental, and then goes on to say that some, notice here, again, you're always fighting for point of view as well. So what's the point of view here? What do we see that's the author's wisecrack? And what's this? What are the points of view of somebody else? So first paragraph, some call this prophetic. Look at what's going on here. Passive voice in that first sentence. So it's not surprising to discover that these artists are often credited with having anticipated political, social upheaval. By whom exactly, right? Not by the author. The author is saying that they are credited in general by other people. Interesting. I'm going to stick with this word some that was used earlier just to be consistent. So some credit the artists with that anticipation. I'm just going to say anticipating upheaval. And then it kind of names one, that doesn't name the critic, but one art critic even goes so far to claim that the prophetic power is the most important characteristic, or it's the chief interest and value of these. So one critic says that the prophetic power is more important than the break with artistic techniques. I'll say art techniques. Okay. Starting to see the outlines of where the author's taking us. So first paragraph, and again, you always want to stop in every paragraph and make sure you're reconnecting everything. Make sure that you have, again, to whatever extent you can be clear about where the author's taking you, that you're taking that moment to anchor yourself in it. It's going to make you more efficient in the long run. So first paragraph, talking about this pre-World War I painters, some other people, not the author, call them prophetic. Author says there's an important break from tradition going on in terms of their artistic techniques, even though those techniques varied widely. Author refers to those same techniques as fundamental, and then says, yeah, what are these other critics doing? They're saying that these artists are, their primary value is the prophetic power in predicting that social and political upheaval that followed, and that's more important to those other people than the breakthroughs in the artistic techniques themselves. Now, does the author say that he or she believes otherwise? Not directly, but I'm starting to wonder here. It sounds like the author is saying, well, these other guys believe that these artists' primary value was in prophesizing what happened next in society. And it kind of feels like where we're headed is that the author is going to say that he or she feels otherwise. Let's see what happens. All right. Okay, nice dense paragraph, nice fancy art criticism kind of language. But here we finally get into the author's point of view, right? So as you look at that fourth line, but the forward-looking quality attributed to these artists should instead be credited to their exceptional aesthetic innovations rather than to any power to make clever guesses about political or social trends. And then it kind of goes on and kind of says more about, hey, what are these authors really doing? They weren't interested in the reformation of society. They were focused on problems of representation and form. In other words, what's going on here? Let's back up again. Make sure we connect this to the first two paragraphs. First paragraph, hey, World War I, pre-World War I painters. Some people over there call them prophetic, but there's an important break from artistic tradition, important break from the representational styles that dated back from the Renaissance. Author is kind of hinting that he or she's more interested in the representational break, the artistic qualities, not the prophetic qualities. Second paragraph, oh, these breaks from tradition are so fundamental. But again, those people over there are crediting the artists with anticipating political upheaval, and that this one critic even says that the prophetic power is more important than the art techniques. And now here we get to the meat of it. The author's saying, oh, no. These guys are wrong. What's going on here? So these painters are not interested in society. They're not prophetic. And that the forward-looking quality that's going on here really should be credited to their exceptional aesthetic innovations. So I'm just going to say aesthetic innovations is the important part. That's the forward-looking quality. So this is about representation. It's about form. It's about the aesthetic innovations. And really, these artists aren't interested at all in making predictions about society. That's just kind of a coincidental thing that people attribute to them. But the author says, no, that's not what the artists were really doing. All right. Seems like we're really getting to the heart of what the author's argument is. One last paragraph. Let's see where it goes. All right, hit the pause button if you need it, as always. Okay, so what do we have going on in this fourth paragraph? So again, third paragraph here, we really got to the meat of the author's argument. No, these authors weren't predicting the future, weren't foreshadowing political and social upheaval of their art. It was just aesthetic innovation. So yes, there's a forward-looking quality because they were doing innovative stuff, had this fundamental break from artistic tradition, but it wasn't meant to be predictive of social and political upheaval. So what's the purpose of this fourth paragraph here? Well, this is really just an example to support this, but in particular, it's an earlier example. So we're reaching back to Delacroix or Delacroix, depending on whether you're American or not American. We always say Delacroix in our art history classes here. So earlier example of Delacroix from back in the 1800s, well before these pre-World War I painters. And that earlier example that's going to support the author's point of view here in basically saying, you've got it right there in the first sentence of that last paragraph. Also important to remember that not all decisive changes in art are quickly followed by dramatic events in the world. Argument here basically is for Delacroix that what happened was, yes, there was a very dramatic break in terms of his style of art, but if anything, it was informed by what had already happened in the world, and it was never meant to be prophetic, and art historians actually agree on that. So earlier example of Delacroix supports this overall thesis by the author, and the idea is that drastic art changes don't always or I'll say aren't always followed by any sort of upheaval. All right, so there we go. Now all this should add up pretty nicely now. So first paragraph, these pre-roll run painters, some other people over there are calling them prophetic. Guess, very important break from tradition. Little hints of the author's point of view here. We don't know exactly where they're headed. And then paragraph 2 kind of deepens this idea. Again, still subtle. These guys over here think the painters are predicting the future, but really the important part, the fundamental part, is these artistic breaks in from tradition. Then we get to the meat, paragraph 3. What's the whole point of this entire essay? Well, it's that these authors weren't really interested in the societal upheaval. They were making aesthetic innovations. They were focused on form and artwork, and yes, forward-looking quality. But it's only because they were doing things that were unique and visionary and innovative in terms of their actual artistic style. Had nothing to do with what was going on in society. And then we back up a little bit to the 1800s. Here's an earlier example, and the author just trying to deepen the point. Hey guys, just because there's a forward-looking quality or a drastic change in art and how it looks, and it doesn't necessarily mean that that's followed by drastic changes in society. All right, a little bit of an unconventional organization to the passage, a little bit muddy as far as what's happening initially, but if you keep focusing on the why, and try to connect the dots, you're going to come out with a really strong understanding in that passage. And once again, these questions should be fairly easy to slice through. And once again, I chose these questions based on the ones that people perform the worst on. So more than half of people on GMAT Club, for example, have missed these questions, and we've seen our students get annihilated by them too. So enjoy. All right, this one's pretty unpleasant. If you need some more time, hit the pause button and take it. Like I said, not messing around here. This is some of the toughest questions we've seen as far as just what the overall stats tell us, what the beatdown from our students tells us. Let me go ahead and get just the question up there on the screen. Which the following most accurately describes the contents of the passage? Now, fundamentally, if we've done our jobs right as far as kind of mapping out the passage, thinking about purpose, thinking about how these paragraphs connect, we should be in good shape here in practice. Boy, this is pretty rough language. A lot of it. Don't get intimidated. Fight your way through. That's a lot of what I was saying at the beginning of the video. A lot of it as you get to the toughest stuff. It's psychological. Be patient, take a breath, fight your way through. The answer's in here somewhere. We've done our jobs right. Okay, I'm running out of space here. I'm going to go ahead and erase the notes from the first paragraph here. Okay. Answer choice A, the author describes an artistic phenomenon. Okay, sure. So what's that phenomenon? It's this break with tradition, kind of these changes in representational form. Okay, great. So break with what happened since the Renaissance. Introduces one interpretation of this phenomenon. Yeah, okay, that's right. So one interpretation is they're prophesizing what happens in society. Okay, what's the next part? Propose an alternative interpretation. Yep, you bet. That's good. Then supports this alternative. Yep, this is supporting the alternative by criticizing the original interpretation. Yeah, that's pretty good. I think you can split hairs here and say this isn't necessarily exactly how I would draw it up. This kind of feels like an example that supports that interpretation. But is it still criticizing the original interpretation? Sure, yeah, it's criticizing the idea that these massive changes in how art is produced don't necessarily predict future upheaval, right? So yeah, this is criticizing the original interpretation. And one thing you're going to run into a lot on the really tough questions, you might not love the right answer. You might be kind of going, it's not perfect. I'm a little uncomfortable with it. Maybe some of the language isn't super precise. Be conservative. Hang on to it. If you don't love this because you think that this should say something about an example for the fourth paragraph, so be it. But don't knock it out because of that. This might be the best we can do. Let's find out. B, the author describes an artistic phenomenon. Sure. identifies the causes of that phenomenon. I don't think so. I don't think paragraph 2 is even remotely getting into what caused that change in artistic styles, all that innovation in styles in the pre-World War I painters. So you could stop there if you wanted to, cross it out. Let's keep going anyway, just to be thorough. Illustrate some of the consequences of the phenomenon. I don't know about that, because this is talking about sort of we're diving into the idea that, yeah, these artists were making aesthetic innovations. They weren't trying to prophesize anything. I'm not sure you'd call those consequences. So I think we're on pretty thin ground there. And then the last bit speculates about the significance of the consequences. Not at all. There's none of that going on here. No speculation about the consequences of what these artists were doing. B is out. C, same beginning, artistic phenomenon. Second paragraph articulates the traditional interpretation of the phenomenon. I might quibble with the word traditional. I'm not sure that that's quite what's being said here, but I'll keep going. I'm not going to cross it out because of that. Identifies 2 common criticisms of this view. No, these aren't common criticisms. That's where all of this work we do on point of view. Hopefully you watched Alex's video, guy with a really good beard, where he talks about point of view and trying to decipher that and trying to really fight to get that point of view out of the passage. No, we've got the author's point of view here. It's not clear at all that these are common criticisms of that view. And even if you could probably stop right there and cross this out, but let's keep going anyway, just to be thorough. Dismisses each of these criticisms by appeal to an example. No, definitely not dismissing the criticisms in paragraph 3, not even close. C's out. D, author describes the phenomenon, presents 2 competing interpretations. Boy, I guess, sort of. Not really. I think we see hints of the author's interpretation, but the author doesn't state it directly. Really, paragraph 2 is entirely about this other interpretation the author disagrees with, that these artistic innovations foreshadow social and political upheaval. So we're on really shaky ground right there. Let's keep going. Dismisses both interpretations. Not at all. By appeal to an example. And then introduce the alternate interpretation. Not at all. Alternate interpretation is here, if anything. So we can cross out D. E, author describes an artistic phenomenon. Once again, identifies the causes of the phenomenon. I don't think we're talking about causes of the phenomenon here. This is just one interpretation of what the artists are doing. These aren't causes. Let's keep going anyway to be safe. Presents an argument for the importance of the phenomenon. I don't think that's what the author's doing here either. Not saying that it's important, not arguing that it's important. It's just arguing that what were these innovations? They were purely aesthetic. They were stylistic. They weren't predictive of future societal trends. And then advocates an attempt to recreate the phenomenon. Nothing at all about recreating the phenomenon here. We're way back in the 18th century with Delacroix. All right, he's out. He's our winner for this one. Hope you're having fun. Next question. All right, take another minute if you need it, as always. All right, one of these nice accept questions. So the thing I always want you to think, and we talk about this in some of our other reading critical reasoning videos, you see that accept, just be very, very clear about what you're trying to do. We're crossing out anything that, according to the author, is something that's contained by the work of these authors. So the work of the pre-World War I painters contains an example of each of the following. So which things does the author think do appear in the work of these painters? Cross those out if it does appear. Okay, let's get just the question by itself here. Now, the temptation when you see something like this feels like a detailed question, feels like you're going to go spelunking around, going and hunting and pecking through the passage. Very, very common thing, especially as you get to the tougher stuff on the GMAT, LSAT, executive assessment. Very often it's the case that a question looks like a detailed question, but really if you've nailed the big picture, done your work initially, Got to be really, really easy to slice through this. So does the author think that the work of these pre-World War I painters contains an interest in issues of representation and form? Oh yeah, that's kind of the whole point, right? Is that the authors are concerned with form, representation. So for sure that's in there, cross that out. Stylistic break with traditional art. Yep, that's all over the place right from the very start. Authors making that point very, very loudly. This very important break from tradition, this break that's so fundamental from traditional art. That's definitely there. We can cross it out. The introduction of new artistic techniques. Absolutely, that's the whole point of all this. These new techniques, these new ways to represent reality. The ability to anticipate later artists. Well, sure. Yeah, absolutely. So there's all this stuff in there about how later artists ended up adopting some of these same techniques. And this forward-looking quality was because of the artistic and the aesthetic innovations, right? So that's definitely there. And I hope that we like E or think that E is not there. Power to predict social changes, 100%. This is the whole point of the entire passage, right? Is that the author does not think that these painters had the power to predict social changes at all. So really, this is a main idea, primary purpose kind of question, disguised as kind of a detail-y accept question. Should be a pretty quick win if you've nailed the overall structure of the passage. All right, one last question on this one, and then we'll move on to a nastier passage. You're excited. All right. Yet again, these all kind of follow a theme. Pretty tough to kind of get to the bottom of this passage and really understand the structure of it nice and clearly. Once you do, this thing's kind of disguised as a detail question. Your instinct is to go diving through that second paragraph. Don't do it once you recognize kind of which painters he's talking about, he or she is talking about. Painters discussed in the second paragraph. Well, yeah, that's all these pre-World War I painters, Picasso, Braque, Malevich, Kandinsky. So which of the characteristics of those painters does the author of the passage appear to value most highly? Well, that's exactly the big picture, all the stuff we've been talking about here. Does the author appear to value these painters' insights into pre-World War I politics? Nope, exactly the opposite. Seems to most highly value their kind of the innovations they made in terms of the aesthetics, the form of their artwork. Visionary nature of their social views, not at all. Again, everything here is meant to refute that idea. Their mastery of techniques of representational art. Again, that's the sort of traditional representational art that dates back to the Renaissance. That's not what the author says is great about these artists. It's their break from those traditions. C is out. D, their ability to adjust to changing social conditions. Not at all. The idea here is that this was purely an aesthetic play, not something where they're really adjusting to social conditions or predicting them. I hope we like E. Their stylistic and aesthetic accomplishments. Exactly. That's exactly what we've been saying all along. All right. If you struggled a bit on this passage, don't feel bad. I'm picking a pretty tough one. Now, this next one, it's my personal opinion, the toughest passage that I've seen my students struggle with. Pulling it out of an old LSAT. I think it's harder than anything I've seen on the GMAT. Just my opinion. Your results may vary, but this one should really, really hurt. It should be pretty awful. Final passage here. Here you go with the first paragraph. All right, fairly short little paragraph here. If you need more time with it, feel free to hit the pause button. So I'm going to warn you in advance, the rest of this passage gets really, really tough. Just getting warmed up here. This paragraph's probably the easiest of them to understand. But it's also not necessarily totally clear where the author's trying to take us. But as always, I want you to fight for purpose, fight to think about point of view, squeeze what you can out of it. That's what's going to set you up for success down the road. So here, notice that nothing here mentioned is the author's point of view. It's all talking about Meyerson, right? So Meyerson, what do we know about Meyerson's point of view? Well, first, he views CLS, her definition of CLS, is that it's trying to debunk orthodox legal theory by exposing contradictions. So debunks CLS, or seeks to debunk CLS. I'm sorry, not CLS. Orthodox legal theory, which I'll just abbreviate here as OLT. Doesn't really matter a whole lot. By exposing contradictions, but her criticism here is CLS, the critical legal studies movement, sees non-existent contradictions. And what else does it do? It overrates the threat that conflict poses to orthodox legal theory. So also that CLS, we'll say it overrates the threat of conflict. Okay, what exactly are those conflicts? Who knows? Not getting into that yet. But again, things I'm trying to pay attention to here that I think are going to set me up later. One is recognizing point of view, not talking about the author here, just talking about Meyerson. This is all Meyerson's point of view. She has her definition of critical legal studies, not what the critical legal studies people necessarily think they're doing, but she says, Meyerson says, that the critical legal studies crowd is seeking to debunk orthodox legal theory by exposing contradictions, but Meyerson says, whoa, a lot of those contradictions are non-existent, number one, and number two, that conflict that threat poses is very much overrated by the CLS crowd. Okay, so lots of criticism here. We know that Meyerson seems to be going after the CLS crowd. No idea what the author thinks yet. All right, one more paragraph. All right, this is starting to get a little dense. Hit the pause button if you need more time with it. Okay, nice long paragraph. Now, again, I'm always fighting for point of view here. This is all still from the point of view of Meyerson. I have no idea what the author's thinking. This is all just Meyerson's view on what CLS is doing. So we're still in that world. What's Meyerson saying about CLS? Well, first of all, she's saying that CLS folks believe that there are conflicting values in the law. So law has conflicting values, which all of a sudden I can't spell, which leads to conflicting answers. And therefore, there's no unique answer to a legal question, which means that any decision made in a case, so any legal answer must be arbitrary. And that's a heck of a thing to say, right? So you come up with some answer in, let's say, a legal case, and it's arbitrary because of these conflicting values. Pretty powerful statement. And basically, Meyerson says, nope, all you have to do is just rank the values, and gives an example of how to do that. So great. Basically, Meyerson's point of view here is that CLS is saying there's conflicting values in the law. That means that there's no unique solution to a legal question. So you're going to have conflicting answers, which means that any solution you choose must be arbitrary. And Meyerson's saying, no, that's no big deal. This threat that you're perceiving from conflicting values really isn't a threat at all. Pulling this back to that first paragraph, CLS is overrating the threat that the contradiction poses because all you really need to do is rank those conflicting values and you can decide what to do. So she's saying, yeah, guys, no big deal. All right, 2 paragraphs down, 2 to go. Go ahead and take a moment on this one. All right, as always, pause if you need to. Boy, this is getting awfully dense, and I'm going to argue 2 things at the same time about this paragraph. On one hand, I think this is really rough to read, and you get some turns of phrase in there. On the contrary, a solution that is not rationally required need not be unreasonable. What? You have to read that. Maybe you're smarter than I am, but first time I saw that, I had to read it 3 or 4 times to make sense of it. But at the same time, really the point made in this paragraph isn't so intense. It's really just kind of an extension of what's being said so far. So again, Meyerson's key point, and we're still 100% in the world of Meyerson, right? There's still nothing about the author's point of view. It's still just Meyerson's points about CLS. And her 2 big points initially in that first paragraph is that the CLS people see a non-existent set of contradictions. They see contradictions where none exist. And that when there is conflict, when there are contradictions, that they overrate the threat. Well, and then kind of in the second paragraph, she's adding to the idea that, well, why is there no threat? Or why are they overrating the threat there? Well, you can always rank those values. You might have 2 conflicting values that lead to 2 different answers to a legal question, but you can just rank the values. That's one solution. And then she says, yeah, but even if you can't rank the values, doesn't say that explicitly here, but says, well, what if there are 2 equally compelling solutions? So paragraph 3 here, Meyerson's saying that 2 equal, I'm just going to say equal solutions. And what she's saying is that it can still be reasonable to choose one of them. Imagine that there was some third solution that's totally ridiculous. So we choose a winner in a conflict based on who's louder. Well, that's totally ridiculous. And then you have 2 totally reasonable equal solutions. Well, it's reasonable to choose one of them, right? How big of a problem is it if you choose one of the reasonable solutions? Not a big deal. So totally reasonable to choose one. So again, what is she saying here? Really, this is just reinforcing the idea that there's this overrating of the threat of conflict. And even if you do have some sort of conflict among conflicting values, and it leads you to 2 equally plausible solutions, it's not necessarily irrational or unreasonable to choose one of them, because if you have 2 reasonable solutions, okay, you choose one. Maybe not such a big deal after all. Maybe that's not such a big threat. All right, one last paragraph. My opinion, this is the toughest of them. Enjoy. All right, tough paragraph. Hit the pause button if you need to. This one's rough, and part of it is, and you see this quite a bit as you get to the really hard passages, start throwing some jargon at you, and it kind of feels like it flies out of left field. We have sort of this terminology about legal formalism, the belief that there's a quasi-deductive method, where'd that come from? And then it gets into the term objectivism, and you can get really hung up there for a while if you wanted to. But again, the general good process here, what you can do to help yourself, as always, if we've done our job so far and we're anchored in, hey, where's this passage going? What seems to be the big picture? Whose point of view are we talking about? We're still in this world where it's all Meyerson, nothing about the author, just Meyerson telling us what she thinks CLS is saying and then debunking it, going after it, right? Okay. So just to recap, because I think it's really, really helpful for interpreting this fourth paragraph. So Meyerson's point of view here is that, hey, here's what CLS is doing. They're trying to debunk orthodox legal theory by exposing its contradictions. And Meyerson is saying, number one, it's seeing contradictions where they really don't exist. And number two, it's overrating the threat of those conflicts. And in particular, CLS, according to Meyerson, says there's conflicting values in the laws that leads to conflicting values. And the CLS people say, well, whatever choice you make, it's going to be irrational, arbitrary. And the rest of it so far, at least, is all about, really including this fourth paragraph, Meyerson saying, no, you can always rank those values and come up with a unique solution. Okay, great. Well, what if there's two equally appealing solutions? Well, you can choose one. It's still reasonable. And now here, this is taking this one step further. We're still on the same track, where basically Meyerson is accusing, or saying that the CLS people are saying, hey, in order to find a solution, you have to believe in the legal authority. So CLS people are saying, must believe, does it say moral authority or legal authority? Yeah, moral authority. Must believe in moral authority to choose. And if we're being really reductionist, what does Denise Meyerson say? She basically says, nah. you can adhere to the rules of the game. You can get to an unambiguous solution without endorsing the rules. So rule endorsement not required. And so you can find an unambiguous answer to a legal question without endorsing the rules. And by the way, maybe they're part of the game anyway. So, all right. All this seems to add up now. All sorts of dense language. Again, this is one of, I would argue, the hardest passage out there that I've ever inflicted on GMAT students. Absolute bloodbath when we feed this to people on GMAT Club. But pretty coherent now, despite a whole lot of rough language, right? So we've got Meyerson's accusation of CLS. Hey, here's what they're doing. Here's the two problems. They see non-existent threats. They overrate the threat. And then paragraph 2 gets into sort of what exactly CLS supposedly believes, that because there are conflicting values in the laws, you get conflicting answers, and then choosing between them is irrational, arbitrary, not a good thing. And then it says, nope, you can always rank the values, no problem, even if you can't, totally reasonable to choose one. And yeah, you don't even have to endorse the rules of the game, which might be part of the game anyway. No big deal. Even if you don't believe in the moral authority of the law, it doesn't matter. You can still pick an unambiguous legal solution. Tough passage. If your brain's cramped, no shame in that at all. Again, very toughest passage I can find based on lots of picking on students. And just to cap it off, I picked 3 questions out of the 7 that originally appear alongside this passage, and they're the 3 toughest questions. Here's the first one. Good luck to you. All right, take another minute if you need it. Tough question, looks really easy. So just primary purpose question, shouldn't have to go referring back to the passage at all. Author's primary purpose, Is it to evaluate divergent legal doctrines? That's not happening at all, right? So this is just Meyerson picking on CLS and saying, hey, this particular legal theory is not great. Here's why. If the CLS guys are wrong, we can cross out A because we're not evaluating any other theory, really. There's mentions of them, but we're not evaluating them. Certainly not the primary purpose. Are we explaining how a controversy arose? Not at all. Really not a controversy here. Meyerson is just picking on something. Maybe she views it as controversial. That's not really the point, though. She disagrees with it. So, and we're certainly not explaining how the controversy arose. B's out. C, advocating a new interpretation of a legal tradition. Not at all. There's really nothing about a legal tradition here. I suppose you could talk about orthodox legal theory as a tradition, but the author is certainly not advocating a new interpretation of legal tradition. Neither is Meyerson. I'm going to stop there for a moment. Here's where, so I'm guessing a lot of you watching picked E. And that sounds really good, right? Refute claims made by various scholars. Sounds fantastic. That is exactly what Denise Meyerson is doing here. She's refuting claims made by various CLS scholars. Yeah, that's exactly what's happening. That's not the question. Question is the author's primary purpose. So one of the things you hear me beating on over and over and over, think about point of view, think about point of view. Whose opinion is this? Whose opinion is this? The question's about the author. The passage is about Meyerson. So all this work we did, we're talking about Meyerson. Meyerson's refuting the claims. The author's not. We don't know what the author thinks. What's the author's purpose? Refute claims? The author never takes sides here. What's the author doing? It's describing Meyerson's challenge to a school of thought. So the author is just describing what Meyerson's doing in response, in challenging the school of thought of CLS. So be really, really careful here. So very, very classic thing. You see it on the GMAT, see it on the LSAT, see it on the executive assessment. If you're not paying really close attention to exactly whose opinion are we looking at here, you get into trouble. And again, if you've already seen it, one of our tutors, Alex, did a fantastic video on point of view. So check that out if you haven't already. He also has a great beard. So even if you're not interested in point of view, it's worth watching him just for the beard. All right, next question. All right, pause if you need to. Okay, another one of those classic setups. It points to a certain chunk of the passage, right? So I'm going to zoom in on that fourth paragraph here. And kind of the temptation is to think, well, hey, if I just kind of reread right around it, I'm going to get to the answer. And like a whole lot of things on these reading comp passages, really, it's all about the big picture. If you've been following what's going on kind of overall with the structure and purpose of the passage, you don't really need to dig too deeply into this exactly, other than just acknowledging, well, what do we mean by external considerations, purpose, policy, and value? That's all of the sort of the idea kind of introduced in particular in the first sentence of this paragraph, saying, well, the legal process has moral authority. So CLS folks say, hey, to find an unambiguous solution to a legal question, you must believe that the law has moral authority. So that's really the sorts of things. So moral authority, purpose, policy, value, you have to endorse those things in order to find a unique solution. Whole point of the paragraph, and in some ways the whole passage, is that Meyerson saying, nah, that's not that big of a deal, right? You don't necessarily have to believe exactly in the moral authority of kind of how the legal system's structured or the policy, value, purpose of the law in order to find an unambiguous solution. And you know what? Maybe those things are kind of part of the legal, part of the game of finding solutions to legal questions anyway. So with that in mind, we'll zoom in on the question itself. Again, pretty thick language here. I think these are hard to parse through. If you're really struggling, no shame in that at all. One of the hardest questions out there. I think something like 70% of people on GMAT Club have gotten this wrong. So it can be inferred from the passage that Meyerson would most likely agree with which of the following statements. Does she agree with the statement that these external considerations of policy and value and purpose in the law, which of these does she agree with? Does she agree that how one determines the extent to which these considerations are relevant depends on one degrees of belief in legal process? Not at all, right? So she's saying that those you can find unambiguous legal solutions without believing fully in the legal process. So we can get rid of A. Similar idea on B, the extent to which these considerations are part of the legal process depends on the extent to which you endorse them. Again, her whole point is, no, you don't really need to do that. C, when these considerations have more moral authority than the law, the former should outweigh the latter. She's not weighing in on that at all. So she's not saying which of these considerations should be more important. There's an example earlier in the passage where she kind of gets into, well, you could rank professional obligation over general moral authority. It's just an example, though, of how you might rank values. She's not saying which values should outweigh the other or which consideration should outweigh the other at all. C's out. D, if one uses these considerations, policy, purpose, value, in determining a legal solution, one's assuming that those policies and values are desirable. Again, no, not at all. So she's saying that you can still find solutions. You can still use those considerations if they're part of the legal game. You can use those considerations to come up with a legal solution. You don't necessarily have to endorse or agree with those policies or values in order to do so. And I hope we like E, which ironically is the easiest one to read, in my opinion. Whether these considerations are separate from or integral to the legal process matter debate, it's exactly what she's saying. Very last sentence of the whole passage. Maybe these things are part of the game, part of the legal process. So we can debate whether they're part of it or whether they're separate from it. That's kind of her whole point at the very, very end. So E is our winner. One last question. We'll put you out of your misery. All right, pause if you need to. Last one here. So it can be inferred from the passage that proponents of CLS would be most likely to hold which of the following views about the law. So not necessarily about orthodox legal theory, which was mentioned in the first paragraph, but the CLS crowd, what are they most likely to believe about the law? That's mostly here in our second paragraph, where the CLS folks, at least according to Meyerson, argue that, hey, the law has conflicting values. As a result of that, you're going to have conflicting answers, and there's no way to choose among those conflicting answers without being arbitrary and irrational. Okay, with that in mind, because that's really the only chunk where it says a lot about what CLS people really believe about the law itself, what can we do with these answer choices? A, it incorporates moral principles in order to yield definitive solutions to legal problems. No, CLS is just arguing that there really aren't definitive solutions, and that's the whole problem. It's all those contradictions that arise that create a real threat. B, it does not necessarily imply approval of any policies or values. That bit actually kind of appears more in the fourth paragraph. So in order to come up with unambiguous legal solutions, you must endorse the values and policies of the legal system. And CLS is saying, no. Like you have to endorse the kind of the rules of the game. You have to endorse the policies and values in order to find a solution. So they would very much disagree with B. C, it is insufficient in and of itself to determine the answer to a legal question. Yeah, that's sounding pretty good. So the law itself is insufficient to determine the answer to a legal question because of these conflicting values. It's exactly what the CLS group is saying. D, it's comparable to the application of rules in a game. No, not at all. Denise Meyerson raises this example of rules of a game, one you might disagree with, where we're stealing things. in order to argue against the CLS people, and the CLS people might charge, well, no, you can't just do that. You can't just create this game that has arbitrary rules like that and have that analogy work. So not D, E, it can be used to determine the best choice between conflicting values. Now, that's the whole point, is that you can't choose between conflicting values. And that's why you necessarily end up with arbitrary irrational solutions. So CLS folks disagree with E. And our answer is C. All right. If you've made it this far, thank you so much for watching, everybody. Congratulations, you've made it to the end of the nastiest passage I could find. The three nastiest questions out of that passage. If you struggle, no shame in it at all. All I can really say is keep practicing. It gets really, really tough if you're trying to shoot from something like a 40 on the GMAT up into the mid 40s. Lots of practice, read some good hard stuff. Might take you some time, but battle through. And again, remember, LSAT passage here, deliberately giving you something really tough. When in doubt, practice with more of these, and it's going to make the GMAT ones feel pretty easy. Going to make the EA ones feel pretty easy as well. Again, thank you for watching. We'll see you next time.